You stand at the base of Mount Ararat, and the wind cuts through your expedition gear with a precision that feels almost personal. It's April 1959, and you've just watched a French explorer named Fernand Navarre emerge from a crevasse, holding what he claims is a piece of hand-tooled wood timber that he insists came from Noah's Ark itself. You see the dark, ancient beam in his weathered hands, and you wonder, what compels a person to spend years of their life, risk everything they have, searching for something that exists primarily in stories told around fires for thousands of years? The search for Noah's Ark isn't new when Navarre makes his discovery. In fact, you need to understand that people have been looking for this vessel since at least the 3rd century BCE, when a Babylonian priest named Berosus wrote about survivors of a great flood traveling to Armenia to scrape pitch from the remnants of an ark. The mountain where this supposedly happened, Mount Ararat, rises 16,854 feet above sea level in eastern Turkey, near the borders with Armenia and Iran. It's a dormant volcano, crowned with perpetual snow and ice, and for centuries it has captured the imagination of travelers, theologians, and adventurers who believe that somewhere in its frozen heights the remains of the biblical ark still rest. But let's talk about what it actually means to search for something like this. When you examine the history of Ararat expeditions, you're looking at a catalog of human obsession, bureaucratic frustration, and the kind of mundane persistence that rarely makes it into adventure stories. Take Friedrich Parrott, a German naturalist who, in 1829, became the first Westerner to successfully summit Ararat with proper documentation. Parrott wasn't particularly interested in Noah's Ark. He was there to study the mountain's geology and collect botanical specimens. Yet even his scientific expedition couldn't escape the shadow of the Ark legend. Local Armenian villagers told him stories about the great ship frozen in the mountain's ice, visible only in certain years when the glaciers melted back enough to reveal it. Parrott dutifully recorded these accounts in his expedition notes, treating them with the same careful attention he gave to his pressed plant samples and rock measurements. What you need to appreciate is the sheer difficulty of conducting any kind of search on Ararat. The mountain sits in a politically sensitive region that has changed hands repeatedly throughout history. By the time serious archaeological interest in the Ark develops in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you're dealing with Ottoman bureaucracy, then Soviet restrictions, then Turkish military concerns about their eastern border. Every expedition requires permits that take months or years to obtain. The mountain itself presents extraordinary physical challenges: altitude sickness, hidden crevasses, sudden storms that can trap climbers for days, and temperatures that plummet to -40 degrees Fahrenheit even in summer at the higher elevations. The first organized expedition specifically seeking the Ark came in 1876, led by James Bryce, a British scholar and politician. Bryce found a piece of hand-worked wood at about 13,000 feet, well above the tree line, where no natural timber should exist. He didn't claim it was from the Ark, but the discovery fueled speculation. What's fascinating about Bryce's find, though, isn't the wood itself, but the meticulous way he documented everything around it: the type of rock nearby, the exact elevation, the weather conditions, the vegetation patterns below. This is how you search for something that might not exist. You catalog everything, because you don't know what detail might later prove significant. By the early 20th century, reports of Ark sightings begin to accumulate in a more systematic way. You have Russian aviators during World War I claiming to see a large wooden structure from the air. You have Hardwick and Knight, a New Zealander, organizing an expedition in 1936 that gets turned back by storms. You have multiple witnesses describing similar features: a large, dark shape embedded in ice on Ararat's northwest face, sometimes visible, sometimes completely covered, depending on the year's snowfall and summer melt. Enter Fernand Navarre, a French demolition contractor who becomes obsessed with the Ark after reading accounts of these sightings. Navarre is important because he represents a particular type of searcher, someone with no academic credentials, no theological training, no archaeological expertise, but an abundance of determination and a willingness to return to the mountain again and again despite failure. His first expedition in 1952 finds nothing. His second in 1953 also yields no results. He comes back in 1955, in 1956, in 1957, Each time, he spends weeks on the mountain, hiring local guides, hauling equipment, mapping ice fields, taking photographs, and finding nothing definite. What does this kind of searching actually look like day to day? You wake in a tent at 14,000 feet, already exhausted from altitude. Your head throbs with a dull ache that never quite goes away. You eat a cold breakfast of dried meat and bread, because fuel is too precious to waste on hot meals. You spend hours trudging through snow that comes up to your thighs, probing ahead with an ice axe to avoid hidden crevasses. You reach a promising ice formation and spend half a day chipping away at it, only to find that the dark shape visible through the ice is just a rock. You photograph everything anyway, because what if that rock's position tells you something about glacier movement or ancient water levels? You return to camp as the sun sets, your fingers numb despite heavy gloves, your entire body aching, knowing you'll do exactly the same thing tomorrow. Navarra's 1,959 expedition follows this same grinding pattern for weeks. He focuses on an area at about 13,500 feet where several previous explorers reported seeing unusual shapes in the ice. He brings his son Raphael with him this time, and together they establish a base camp and begin the systematic work of investigating promising locations. They drill test holes, they map ice flows, they examine every unusual formation, and then, on a day that starts like any other, Raphael notices something while they're photographing a glacier face. The ice has melted back slightly in the past week due to unusual warmth, and what appears to be worked timber is visible in a crevasse. Not just any wood hand-tooled beams, darkened with age, clearly shaped by humans. They carefully extract several pieces, the largest measuring about 5 feet long. The wood is hard, dense, almost fossilized. When you hold it, and you can imagine holding it, feeling its weight, running your fingers along the tool marks, you're touching something that carbon dating would later suggest is approximately 5,000 years old. But here's where the story gets complicated in ways that pure adventure narratives usually ignore. Navarra brings his samples down from the mountain, and what happens next involves years of laboratory analysis, academic debate, and the kind of methodical scientific investigation that makes for terrible dinner party stories but excellent history. The wood gets sent to multiple labs. The Spanish Forestry Institute in Madrid examines it. The University of Bordeaux runs tests. A laboratory in Cairo analyzes the cellular structure. Carbon dating places the samples somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years old, though different labs get slightly different results using different methodologies. What does aged wood actually tell you? If you're a dendrochronologist, someone who studies tree rings, you can determine not just the wood's age, but potentially where it grew, what climate conditions it experienced, even what season it was cut. The Navarra samples show evidence of having been submerged in water for extended periods. They show marks consistent with tools available in the ancient Near East. They come from oak, a wood valued in ancient construction for its strength and water resistance. These are boring facts, perhaps, but they're the facts that matter when you're trying to establish whether a piece of wood is historically significant or just timber that got carried up the mountain in some other way centuries ago. The scientific community's response to Navarra's discovery reveals something important about how archaeological evidence actually works. Some researchers point out that wood this old at this elevation, showing these specific characteristics, deserves serious investigation. Others note that Islamic pilgrims have been visiting Ararat for over 1,000 years, sometimes carrying wood for fires, and that Armenian Christians built monasteries and shrines on the mountain's lower slopes throughout the medieval period. Any of these activities could explain the presence of worked timber at high elevation without requiring the existence of Noah's Ark. What you're witnessing here is the fundamental tension in biblical archaeology, the space between faith and evidence, between what people hope to find and what the physical record actually supports. Navarra believes he's found the Ark. He writes books about it. He gives lectures. He returns to the mountain in 1969 and extracts more wood samples from the same general area. But belief and proof occupy different territories, and the question that his discovery raises isn't really, is this Noah's Ark? But rather, what would constitute proof even if the Ark existed? Consider what an ark-like structure would need to be to survive 4,000 plus years on a mountain. Wood degrades, even in ice. Glaciers move, grinding anything trapped in them into splinters. Avalanches regularly reshape Ararat's upper slopes. The mountain experiences earthquakes in 1840. A massive quake triggered an avalanche that buried the Armenian village of Ahora and killed thousands of people. Any structure exposed to these conditions for millennia would be, at best, fragmentary, at worst, completely destroyed. So if you're searching for the Ark, you're really searching for the ghost of the Ark traces, suggestions, pieces that might once have been part of something larger. This brings us back to that moment when Navarra emerges from the crevasse holding his piece of ancient timber. You're watching a man who has dedicated years of his life to this search, who has spent his own money on repeated expeditions, who has risked his life in the ice. What he's holding might be significant. It might be nothing. The uncertainty doesn't diminish his achievement, the sheer physical accomplishment of finding and extracting this artifact, but it does complicate the story in ways that adventure narratives rarely acknowledge. The story of searching for Noah's Ark is really a story about how we search for anything that connects us to our foundational stories. It's about the human need to make myths tangible, to touch what we've only heard about. And it's about the maddening gap between what we can prove and what we believe. As you stand there in 1959, watching Navarra and his son carefully pack their samples for the journey down the mountain, you might wonder, does it matter what the wood actually is, or does the searching itself, the decades of trying, the careful documentation, the willingness to return again and again despite failure constitute its own kind of discovery? The samples would travel to laboratories around the world. Navarra would spend the rest of his life defending his find and organizing new expeditions. Other searchers would follow his paths, seeking their own pieces of the mystery. But before we follow those paths, we need to understand what else has been found on the mountain, the other discoveries, the competing claims, the accumulating evidence that makes the story far more complex than a single expedition could reveal. The question isn't just what Navarra found, but what pattern his discovery fits into, and whether that pattern points toward something real or simply toward our need to believe in something beyond the ordinary limits of history. Navarra's discovery sets off a cascade of new interest in Ararat, but to understand what happens next, you need to appreciate how slowly archaeological investigation actually proceeds. The wood samples don't immediately prove or disprove anything. They sit in laboratories for months while technicians prepare them for testing. Carbon dating in the 1,960 seconds requires destroying significant portions of the sample, so researchers debate how much of Navarra's precious wood to sacrifice to the testing process. Different laboratories want to verify each other's results, which means more samples must be extracted, more permits obtained, more expeditions mounted. Meanwhile, you have the question of documentation. Navarra took photographs of where he found the wood, but glacier ice is notoriously difficult to photograph in ways that allow later verification. Ice formations change. Crevasses open and close. The precise location becomes a matter of debate. Some critics suggest that Navarra might have brought wood up the mountain and discovered it there, though this theory requires believing that a man would spend years of his life and substantial money on an elaborate fraud for relatively little gain. Possible, certainly, but it requires its own leap of faith. What's more interesting than the question of fraud is the question of methodology. How should you search for something like the Ark? In the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, new technologies begin to change what's possible. Aerial photography improves. Researchers start using systematic grid patterns to map the mountain's ice fields. The Turkish government occasionally opens and closes access to the mountain, depending on political considerations and security concerns about the nearby borders, which means expeditions must be planned around these unpredictable windows of opportunity. You also have the emergence of competing theories about where exactly to search. Some researchers focus on the northwest face of Ararat, where most reported sightings have occurred. Others investigate the northeast face, where deep gorges and ice fields might conceal large structures. Still others wonder whether the Ark might have landed on Little Ararat, the volcano's smaller companion peak, or somewhere else entirely in the region. Ancient texts don't provide GPS coordinates, after all. The Bible says mountains of Ararat, plural, which could refer to a range rather than a specific peak. The Babylonian flood story places the landing in the Assyrian mountains. The Quran mentions Mount Judi, which some scholars identify with a mountain in modern-day Turkey, hundreds of miles from Ararat. This geographical uncertainty matters because it affects how resources get allocated. Every expedition costs tens of thousands of dollars in modern terms: equipment, permits, guides, transportation, supplies. Most searches find nothing, which doesn't mean nothing is there, only that the searchers looked in the wrong place, at the wrong time, or lacked the right tools. The history of ark searching is largely a history of failure, which makes it, in a way, a perfect subject for understanding how archaeological investigation actually works. Success is rare. Most days involve tedious work that yields nothing. The meaningful discoveries happen against a backdrop of countless unrewarding hours. Take the Search Foundation expeditions of the 1,960 seconds. This organization, founded by American enthusiasts, mounted multiple well-funded searches of Ararat. They brought ground-penetrating radar, primitive by modern standards but cutting-edge for the time. They hired experienced mountaineers. They worked closely with Turkish authorities. Their expeditions found anomalies, unusual shapes beneath the ice, areas where ground-penetrating radar suggested cavities or dense objects. But anomalies aren't evidence. They're just places worth investigating further, and further investigation requires more permits, more money, more time. The team would identify a promising location, return the next year with drilling equipment, and find that the glacier had shifted, the ice formation had changed, and the anomaly was no longer detectable. Or they'd drill down and find rock. Or they'd find wood fragments that turned out to be from known historical sources, timber from an ancient outpost, debris from a long-destroyed shrine. Each non-discovery teaches something about the mountain's geology, its ice patterns, its history of human use. But it doesn't bring searchers closer to the ark. What sustains people through this kind of work? When you read the journals and reports of ark searchers, you find a particular personality type emerging. These are people comfortable with uncertainty. They're often self-funded, driven by personal conviction rather than institutional support. They tend to be methodical, even obsessive, in their documentation. They keep searching after others have given up, not because they have better evidence, but because the searching itself has become meaningful to them. Consider Alfred Lee, an American oil pipeline engineer who conducted multiple expeditions to Ararat in the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds. Lee wasn't funded by any religious organization. He didn't write popular books about his searches. He simply kept going back, documenting ice formations, collecting wood samples when he found them, mapping the mountain with increasing precision. His journals contain page after page of technical observations, ice depth measurements, compass bearings, weather patterns, equipment performance notes. The ratio of meaningful finds to total observations is vanishingly small, but Lee maintained that even negative results contributed to understanding where the ark wasn't, which progressively narrowed the search area. This logic is hard to argue with, yet it raises a question. At what point does a search become quixotic? If you spend a lifetime looking for something and never find definitive proof, has your life been wasted? Or does the searching itself have value independent of the outcome? These aren't rhetorical questions. They touch on fundamental issues about how we invest meaning in our activities, how we balance hope against evidence, how we decide when to persist and when to abandon a quest. The 1,970 seconds bring a new technological development: satellite imagery. You can now examine Ararat from space using infrared and other wavelength analyses to identify anomalies invisible to ground observers. The first satellite images show a formation on the northwest face that some researchers interpret as a large, roughly rectangular shape beneath the ice. Skeptics point out that natural geological formations often create rectangular patterns, that image resolution is insufficient for definitive interpretation, that the human tendency toward pattern recognition, seeing faces in clouds, shapes in random noise, makes it dangerous to overinterpret such data. But the satellite images inspire new expeditions. In 1974, an international team that includes French, American, and Turkish researchers establishes a base camp and conducts the most systematic search yet attempted. They divide the search area into a grid, with each team assigned specific sectors. They use handheld radios to coordinate their efforts, marking interesting formations for later investigation. They photograph everything. They take ice core samples. They collect any wood fragments they encounter. The expedition lasts 6 weeks and covers more ground than all previous searches combined. What they find is ambiguous. Multiple wood fragments, all consistent with ancient construction, but none definitively linkable to a single large structure. Ice formations that suggest possible cavities beneath, but which could also be explained by natural processes. Photographic evidence of what might be worked timber embedded in glacier ice, but which remains inaccessible without industrial-scale excavation equipment that would be impossible to bring to the site. The expedition report, published in 1975, exemplifies the frustrating nature of archaeology. The researchers conclude that anomalies warrant further investigation and that the presence of worked wood at high elevations suggests human activity in ancient times, but they cannot confirm the existence of any ark-like structure. It's a report that satisfies no one too cautious for believers, too suggestive for skeptics. You're left, as observers of this history, in a similar position to the searchers themselves, looking at pieces of evidence that don't quite cohere into a definitive picture. The wood exists multiple samples from multiple expeditions, consistently dated to the right general time period, showing the right types of construction techniques. The reports of sightings accumulate aviators, mountaineers, local villagers, all describing similar features in similar locations. The satellite imagery shows anomalies, but none of it proves what believers want it to prove. This is where the story of ark searching reveals something important about the nature of historical evidence. We tend to think of proof as binary, something is either proven or unproven, but most historical investigation operates in the murky territory between. You have suggestions, implications, possibilities. You have evidence that's consistent with a theory without confirming it. You have absence of disproof, which isn't the same as proof. The question of what's still inside the ark, if it exists, becomes almost metaphysical when you consider how little of any ancient structure could survive intact. Think about what we actually find when we excavate ancient sites. At Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash under near-perfect conditions, we get extraordinary detail, but even there, wood has largely rotted away, fabrics are gone, organic materials have vanished. What survives are stone, ceramics, metals, and occasional carbonized organic material. An wooden ark exposed to ice and weather for thousands of years would be, at best, a skeleton of itself. So when people ask what's inside the ark, they're perhaps asking the wrong question. The better question might be, what traces would an ark leave? And if those traces exist, are they distinguishable from the traces of other human activity on the mountain over millennia? Could you ever prove that specific pieces of wood came from a single structure rather than from multiple sources? Could you establish that such a structure was a vessel rather than a building or shrine? These questions don't have clear answers, which is why the search continues long after Navarra's initial discovery. By the late 1972, something shifts in ark archaeology. The focus begins moving away from Ararat proper toward other formations and sites. Some researchers start investigating the Darupanar Formation, a boat-shaped geological feature about 15 miles from Ararat, discovered in 1959 by aerial photographs. This formation, roughly the dimensions the Bible assigns to the ark, becomes the focus of intense investigation in the 1,980 seconds. Ground-penetrating radar suggests regular patterns beneath the surface. Metal detector sweeps reveal iron concentrations in patterns that some argue suggest ancient rivets or brackets. But here again, you encounter the same evidential problems. Natural geological processes can create boat-shaped formations. Mineral deposits can concentrate in regular patterns without human intervention. The formation could be exactly what it appears to be, an interesting geological feature, or it could be something more. The investigation continues, with the same mix of promising hints and ultimate ambiguity that characterizes all ark searches. What this reveals is that the question of Noah's Ark is not really a question about a single object or location. It's a question about how we interpret patterns of evidence, how we balance hope against skepticism, how we decide what constitutes sufficient proof for extraordinary claims. And underneath all of it is a deeper question about what we're actually searching for. Is it the Ark itself, or is it confirmation of the stories we've inherited? Validation that the foundational narratives of our cultures point toward real events rather than just metaphors and myths? These aren't questions with simple answers, which is perhaps why the search continues to draw people generation after generation, each convinced that the right technology, the right location, the right interpretive framework will finally resolve what remains unresolved. The deeper you go into the history of Ark searching, the more you realize that the story isn't really about finding a boat. It's about the human relationship with the past, with sacred texts, with the border between history and legend. By the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds, the nature of these expeditions begins to change in subtle but significant ways. The Romantic era of individual searchers like Navarra gives way to more organized efforts, usually backed by religious organizations or foundations with specific theological commitments. This changes both the methodology and the interpretation of findings. Consider the shift in how evidence gets presented. In Navarra's era, discoveries were reported with appropriate caveats. This might be significant. Further investigation is needed. Alternative explanations exist. But as institutional backing grows, so does the tendency toward certainty. Organizations that have raised money from donors expecting results face pressure to present findings positively. Ambiguous evidence gets framed more definitively. The language shifts from possibly to likely to sometimes definitely, even when the underlying evidence hasn't become more conclusive. This isn't necessarily dishonesty, it's the natural pressure of institutional imperatives colliding with archaeological uncertainty. When you've spent donor money on expensive expeditions, when you've promised supporters that you're close to proving the Ark's existence, when your organization's continued funding depends on maintaining enthusiasm and belief, the temptation to overinterpret evidence becomes powerful. And because Ark searching operates at the margins of mainstream archaeology, most professional archaeologists view it as pseudo-archaeology. Driven more by religious commitment than scientific methodology, there's less peer review, less critical examination of claims, less institutional pushback against overreach. You can see this dynamic clearly in the various expeditions to the Darupanar Formation in the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds. A team led by Ron Wyatt, a nurse anesthetist from Tennessee, with no formal archaeological training, conducts extensive metal detector and ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site. Wyatt reports finding regular patterns of metal concentrations that he interprets as iron brackets that once held the Ark's wooden planks together. He reports finding stone anchors nearby that he claims were used by the Ark. He produces videos and books describing his findings in definitive terms. This is Noah's Ark. The evidence is overwhelming. Skeptics are ignoring the truth. But when you examine Wyatt's actual evidence with the kind of scrutiny applied to mainstream archaeological sites, the certainty dissolves. The metal concentrations could be natural mineral deposits. The area is geologically active and rich in various ores. The stone anchors are large drilled stones, which do appear at various ancient sites throughout the Near East, but which were used for many purposes, not just as ship anchors. The boat-like shape of the formation is interesting, but geologists point out that limestone formations commonly weather into regular shapes, including oval and boat-like forms, especially in areas with directional water flow that erodes rock in consistent patterns. The scientific controversy surrounding Darupanar reveals something important about how extraordinary claims should be evaluated. Several geologists from respected universities visit the site in the late 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds to conduct independent assessments. They conclude unanimously that the formation is geological, not archaeological. They point to the formation's integration with the surrounding rock strata, the absence of clear boundaries between the boat and the surrounding geology, the lack of any definitively artificial materials or structures. One geologist notes that if you look at enough satellite imagery of eroded landscapes, you'll find dozens of boat-shaped formations, along with formations that look like faces, pyramids, animals, and various other shapes that human pattern recognition wants to interpret as meaningful. Yet these scientific assessments don't end the investigation or even significantly dampen enthusiasm among believers. This reveals something crucial about how evidence functions in communities of faith versus communities of science. In scientific frameworks, a hypothesis that can't withstand critical examination gets abandoned or modified. In faith-based frameworks, evidence that seems to support belief gets embraced, while contrary evidence gets explained away or attributed to bias, closed-mindedness, or even conspiracy. You see this most clearly in how criticism gets framed. When mainstream archaeologists and geologists express skepticism about Ark claims, proponents often characterize this skepticism not as reasonable scientific caution, but as hostility to religious belief. The narrative becomes, secular scientists don't want to find the Ark because it would validate the Bible. This framing ignores that many of the skeptical scientists are themselves religious, and that scientific skepticism isn't about hostility to religion, but about maintaining evidential standards that have proven reliable across all domains of inquiry. The question of standards matters immensely. In professional archaeology, before you can claim to have found a significant artifact, you need multiple lines of converging evidence. You need stratigraphic context, clear understanding of how the artifact relates to surrounding layers of soil and rock. You need material analysis that unambiguously distinguishes artificial from natural features. You need dating that's consistent across multiple methods. You need peer review by qualified experts who can check your methodology and interpretations. You need to consider and rule out alternative explanations. Apply these standards to Ark claims, and everything becomes less certain. The wood samples? Their age is roughly right for the biblical timeline, but that only means they're from the right era, not that they're from the Ark specifically. The worked timber? It demonstrates human activity at high elevation in ancient times, which is interesting but not proof of any specific structure. The satellite anomalies? Geological formations that warrant investigation, but which haven't yielded definitive artificial features when examined up close. The eyewitness accounts? Centuries of reported sightings that remain frustratingly nonspecific and unverifiable. This brings us to a fascinating aspect of the Ark search: the role of modern technology and how it both helps and hinders understanding. By the 2000s, satellite imagery becomes vastly more sophisticated. You can examine Ararat from space with resolution that reveals features as small as a few meters across. Digital elevation models allow three-dimensional analysis of the terrain. Ground-penetrating radar becomes portable and powerful enough to see deep beneath ice and rock. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras can survey areas previously accessible only through dangerous climbing. Yet this technological progress hasn't resolved the Ark question. If anything, it has complicated it. Better satellite imagery reveals more anomalies, more unusual formations, more places that might warrant investigation. But it also reveals how geologically complex the mountain is, how many natural features can look suggestive from certain angles or under certain conditions. Each new technology opens new questions while definitively answering few. There's a 2006 expedition backed by a Hong Kong-based evangelical organization that exemplifies this dynamic. The team uses cutting-edge ground-penetrating radar to survey a glacial formation on Ararat's northwest face. Their data shows what appears to be a large cavity beneath the ice with regular dimensions. They drill down and retrieve wood samples. They release photographs of what they claim are wooden compartments or rooms within a structure preserved under the ice. The images go viral, making international news. But when independent analysts examine the images and data, problems emerge. The photographs are dark, low resolution, and difficult to interpret. The wood visible in the images could be from a structure, but could also be debris that accumulated in a natural ice cave. The ground-penetrating radar data, when reviewed by experts not affiliated with the expedition, reveals patterns consistent with either a cavity containing wooden material or a region of mixed ice and rock that creates similar radar signatures. The samples get dated by the expedition's chosen laboratories, but the team doesn't release enough material for independent verification by other labs. This is the pattern that repeats across decades of Ark searching. Suggestive findings that don't quite rise to the level of proof, released with more certainty than the evidence warrants, followed by criticism from the scientific mainstream, followed by claims that the criticism is motivated by bias. The cycle reinforces both belief and skepticism without genuinely advancing understanding. What would it actually take to prove the Ark's existence? This isn't a rhetorical question, it has specific, technical answers. You would need to find a structure clearly artificial and maritime in construction, preserved in sufficient condition to demonstrate its ship-like nature. You would need the structure to be in a location consistent with ancient flood narratives and too high in elevation to be explained by later human transport. You would need organic materials from the structure to date consistently to the right time period across multiple independent laboratories using multiple dating methods. You would need to rule out other explanations that it's not a later building, not a natural formation, not debris from known historical activity. You would need all of this to be documented in a way that allows independent verification and published in peer-reviewed venues where methodology and findings can be critiqued by qualified experts. None of the discoveries so far meet these criteria. Some come close on one or two points but fail on others. And this brings us back to the fundamental question. Given the extreme difficulty of meeting these evidential standards for any ancient wooden structure that's been exposed to the elements for millennia, is it even reasonable to expect such proof? If the Ark existed, would any amount of it survive in recognizable form? Or would you only ever find fragments, traces, suggestions exactly what has been found, which could equally well be explained other ways? These questions don't have comforting answers. They leave you in the same uncertain space that has characterized Ark searching from the beginning. The evidence isn't definitive enough to prove the Ark exists, but it's suggestive enough that people keep searching. The pattern of that searching, the discoveries and non-discoveries, the hopes and disappointments. The interpretive battles over ambiguous evidence tells us less about Bronze Age maritime construction than it does about ourselves, about what we need from the past, about how we navigate the space between faith and proof. And yet, the search continues. Every few years, a new expedition returns to Ararat. New technologies get deployed. New locations get investigated. The story remains unfinished not because the mountain hasn't been thoroughly searched by now. It has been mapped, surveyed, and investigated more extensively than almost any comparable archaeological site, but because the question being asked isn't really an archaeological question at all. It's a question about whether the sacred stories that shape our understanding of the world point toward literal historical events or toward something else. Metaphors, myths, deeply felt truths that don't require physical proof to be meaningful. As you contemplate this history, standing metaphorically where Navarra stood when he held that ancient wood in his hands, you might ask yourself, does it matter? If the Ark definitively existed, if its remains were found and verified beyond any doubt, would that change anything fundamental about how we understand ourselves, our history, our relationship with the divine? Or would it simply satisfy a curiosity, answer a question, provide closure to a story that has remained productively open for thousands of years? The answer, perhaps, depends on what you're really searching for when you search for Noah's Ark. You need to understand something about archaeological expeditions that popular accounts rarely capture. Most of the time, you find nothing. Not nothing in the sense of having wasted your time, but nothing in the sense that the ground you excavate, the ice you chip through, the coordinates you investigate yield only rocks, soil, and natural debris. The romance of discovery obscures the tedious reality of systematic searching, and nowhere is this more evident than in the century-long effort to locate Noah's Ark. If you want to understand what has actually been found, or more precisely, what hasn't been found, you need to sit with the expedition reports, the permit applications, the budget spreadsheets, and the daily logs of searchers who returned from the mountain empty-handed. Let's start with a less glamorous question. How do you organize a search for something that might not exist? The logistics alone provide insight into the nature of this quest. Take the 1984 expedition, led by former astronaut James Irwin, who walked on the moon during Apollo 15. Irwin, a devout Christian, became convinced that finding the Ark was his calling. He organized 5 separate expeditions to Ararat between 1982 and 1990, and if you examine the documentation from these efforts, you see the mundane reality beneath the spiritual mission. First, there are the Turkish permits. Applications run to hundreds of pages, requiring detailed maps of intended search areas, lists of all personnel and their qualifications, inventories of equipment, proof of insurance, statements of purpose that must be carefully worded to satisfy both scientific and political concerns. The Turkish government is protective of Ararat. Partly for security reasons, it's near sensitive borders, and partly to control Ark-related tourism and publicity. Each permit application takes months to process, with no guarantee of approval. Irwin's 1,982 application was denied. His 1,983 application was approved, but with restrictions on where he could search. His 1,984 application was initially approved, then revoked mid-expedition due to bureaucratic confusion, forcing an early departure. Then there's the equipment. For a month-long expedition, you need climbing gear, camping supplies, communications equipment, scientific instruments, and safety equipment sufficient for a team of 10 to 15 people operating at high altitude in severe weather. You need ground-penetrating radar units, which in the 1,980 seconds weigh over 100 pounds and require their own power sources. You need ice drilling equipment, cameras with special lenses for glacier photography, GPS devices just becoming available for civilian use, altimeters, weather monitoring equipment. Every piece must be rugged enough to withstand extreme cold, light enough to be hauled up the mountain, and reliable enough that equipment failure doesn't endanger lives. The budget for Irwin's expeditions typically ran to $200,000, $300,000 in 1,980 seconds dollars, closer to $1 million in current terms. This money came from donations, with donors expecting results. The pressure this created wasn't subtle. Every expedition needed to produce something, if not definitive evidence of the Ark, then at least compelling indications that justified continued searching and funding. Now consider what actually happens on these expeditions. Irwin's team would establish a base camp around 14,000 feet, then spend days acclimating to the altitude. Altitude sickness is no joke: headaches, nausea, difficulty sleeping, impaired judgment. You're trying to do careful scientific work while your body is slowly suffocating from oxygen deprivation. Every physical activity takes twice the effort it would at sea level. Carrying equipment becomes exhausting. Even thinking clearly becomes harder. The team would divide into smaller groups, each assigned to investigate specific locations based on previous reports or satellite imagery analysis. A typical day might involve 8 hours of climbing and searching, during which you'd cover perhaps a mile of terrain, investigating ice formations, taking photographs, using ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the surface. At the end of the day, you'd return to camp, catalog your findings, typically nothing significant, review the next day's target areas, and repeat. Irwin's 5 expeditions to Ararat found interesting things: wood fragments at high elevation, unusual ice formations, areas where radar suggested anomalies worth further investigation, but none of it was definitive. The wood pieces, when dated, showed ages ranging from a few hundred to several thousand years old, consistent with human activity on the mountain across different periods, but not clearly attributable to any single ancient structure. The ice formations, while sometimes suggestive of possible cavities beneath, never yielded clear evidence of worked timber when investigated. The radar anomalies, promising as they seemed on screen, typically resolved into natural geological features when examined directly. What you're witnessing in these expedition reports is the archaeology of absence, careful documentation of what isn't there. This sounds pointless, but it's actually how systematic investigation works. By cataloging negative results, by mapping areas where the Ark definitely isn't, searchers progressively narrow the possibilities. It's like a very slow process of elimination played out across decades on a mountain that actively resists being searched. The resistance is both physical and political. In 1990, Irwin's team was climbing on the mountain when they were detained by Kurdish rebels who controlled parts of the region. The team was held for several days before being released unharmed, but the incident highlighted the security challenges that affect all expeditions to Ararat. The mountain sits in a region where Turkish government forces, Kurdish separatist groups, and occasionally Iranian military patrols all operate. Expeditions require not just permits but also sometimes escorts, negotiations with local power brokers, and careful navigation of ethnic and political tensions. Between 1991 and 1999, Turkish authorities essentially shut down permits for Ark expeditions entirely. The official reason was security concerns during the height of the Kurdish conflict, but the result was a near-decade gap in systematic searching. During this period, you have reports of illegal climbs by individuals who snuck onto the mountain without permits, but no major documented expeditions. The pause is significant because it meant that discoveries made in the 1,980 seconds couldn't be followed up on. Ice formations change, coordinates become unreliable as glaciers shift. Promising locations identified in one era might be buried or transformed by the time access returns. When expeditions resume in the early 2000s, they benefit from improved technology but face the same fundamental challenge. The mountain is enormous, constantly changing, and any ark-like structure would likely be buried under substantial ice. Think about the scale problem. Ararat's summit plateau alone covers several square miles. The various glaciers on the mountain encompass tens of square miles of ice. A structure the size of the biblical ark, about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high according to Genesis, could be completely invisible under even modest ice coverage, especially if it's been flattened or broken apart by glacier movement over millennia. This is where ground-penetrating radar becomes both essential and frustrating. GPR works by sending radio waves into the ground or ice and measuring how they reflect back. Different materials reflect waves differently, so in theory you can identify cavities, dense objects, or anomalies beneath the surface without digging. In practice, reading GPR data requires expertise and involves significant interpretation. Ice, especially glacial ice with varying density and embedded rocks, creates complex reflection patterns. What looks like a clear cavity at one frequency might disappear when scanned at another frequency. What appears to be a regular, artificial structure in one set of scans might be explained as a natural feature when examined from different angles. A 2008 expedition funded by Daniel McGivern, a businessman from Hawaii, brought state-of-the-art GPR equipment to survey the Chehenam-Dere Glacier on Ararat's northeastern face. The team spent 3 weeks conducting systematic scans, generating terabytes of data. When analyzed, the data showed numerous anomalies, areas where the radar suggested regular structures or cavities beneath the ice. The team marked the most promising locations and planned return visits to excavate. But here's what happened. Obtaining permits for excavation required proving that the anomalies were likely to be significant. The Turkish authorities wanted more than radar data. They wanted compelling reasons to allow potentially destructive digging on the mountain. The expedition team submitted their data along with interpretations suggesting the anomalies could be artificial structures. Turkish archaeological officials consulted their own experts, who reviewed the data and concluded the anomalies were more likely geological. The excavation permits were denied. This bureaucratic rejection reveals an important dynamic in archaeology. Unlike excavations at conventional archaeological sites, where governmental cultural ministries are generally supportive of research, Ark searches face skepticism from official archaeologists who view such expeditions as pseudo-scientific. The burden of proof becomes higher. You need not just interesting findings, but overwhelming evidence to justify continued investigation. And interesting findings are exactly what Ark searches produce, not overwhelming evidence, just persistent, intriguing hints. The pattern of promising leads that don't pan out extends beyond Ararat proper. In the 1,990 seconds and 2000s, attention increasingly turned to alternative sites. The Darupanar Formation, which we touched on earlier, became the focus of numerous expeditions. But equally interesting is the story of the Ararat anomaly, a feature visible in satellite photographs since the 1,970 seconds that some researchers believe could be the arc. The anomaly appears as a dark, roughly rectangular shape on Ararat's northwest face, visible in satellite imagery taken under certain conditions, usually in late summer when snowmelt exposes more of the underlying ice and rock. The feature is approximately the right size and shape to be a large wooden vessel. It appears at about 15,500 feet elevation, well above any elevation where natural timber could grow. And it's visible only intermittently, suggesting it's embedded in ice that sometimes covers it completely. The first clear satellite images of the anomaly came from a CIA reconnaissance satellite in 1949. Ironically, one of the first satellite photographs ever taken showed this feature, though it remained classified for decades. When the images were finally declassified and published in the 1,990 seconds, they reignited interest in the site. Multiple expeditions attempted to reach the anomaly for direct investigation, but the location is extremely difficult to access. It sits in an area prone to avalanches, surrounded by crevasse fields, requiring technical ice climbing to approach safely. In 2003, Ahmet Ertugrul, a Turkish mountaineer, led an expedition that managed to reach the vicinity of the anomaly. His team reported finding what appeared to be worked timber embedded in the ice, but were unable to extract samples before deteriorating weather forced them off the mountain. Subsequent attempts to reach the site in 2004 and 2005 were turned back by dangerous ice conditions. As of 2010, no expedition had successfully excavated the anomaly or definitively determined what it is. This is typical of the Ark search, promising locations that remain tantalizingly uninvestigated, not because people aren't trying, but because the mountain itself prevents definitive investigation. Every few years, an expedition announces plans to finally reach the anomaly, excavate properly, and determine once and for all what's there. Permits get filed, money gets raised, teams assemble. Then weather intervenes, or political conditions change, or Turkish authorities become concerned about avalanche risk and deny final permission for the approach. The anomaly remains visible in satellite photos, dark against the ice, shape suggestive but nature undetermined. The catalog of these near misses, these almost discoveries, these investigations that couldn't quite reach their targets, forms a significant part of the Ark search history. It's easy to dismiss this as a story of failure, but that misses something important. Each expedition, even when it finds nothing definitive, adds to the accumulated knowledge about the mountain. Ice patterns get mapped, glacier movements get documented, historical records of what was seen and where help future searchers narrow their focus. Even wood samples that turn out to be from sources other than the Ark contribute to understanding the mountain's history of human use. Consider the wood fragments found by various expeditions over the decades. By 2010, researchers had collected samples from at least 30 different locations on Ararat, ranging from 10,000 to 16,000 feet elevation. Carbon dating of these samples revealed ages from a few hundred years old, likely from Islamic pilgrimage sites, to over 6,000 years old. The older samples are fascinating because they demonstrate human activity at extreme elevations in the early Bronze Age, during the period when the biblical flood supposedly occurred. But do these samples come from a single structure like an ark, or do they represent multiple different sources, shrines, camps, carried timber accumulated over centuries? Dendrochronology, the study of tree ring patterns, should theoretically help answer this. If samples came from the same structure, they should show matching ring patterns, indicating the trees they came from grew in the same location during the same period and were cut at roughly the same time. But the analysis has been inconclusive. Some samples show patterns that could be consistent with related timbers, but the wood is so aged and damaged that clear ring patterns are often impossible to establish. The science isn't definitive, which leaves room for competing interpretations. This interpretive flexibility is perhaps the most significant finding from a century of Ark searching. The evidence is ambiguous enough to support multiple reasonable conclusions. If you approach the data wanting to believe the Ark exists, you can find patterns that suggest it might. If you approach skeptically, you can explain everything through natural processes and unrelated human activity. The mountain keeps its secrets not through hiding them completely, but through revealing only enough to be tantalizing without being conclusive. There's something almost philosophical about this. The Ark search has consumed millions of dollars, decades of effort, risked numerous lives, and produced a massive catalog of documentation. Yet after all that investment, we're left essentially where we started. The Ark might be on Ararat, or it might not. The wood fragments might be significant, or they might not. The satellite anomalies might be artificial structures, or they might not. The investigation has narrowed the possibilities without eliminating the central uncertainty. Does this mean the searches were pointless? Not necessarily. They've produced detailed maps of Ararat, documented glacier dynamics, cataloged biological and geological features, and created a historical record of the mountain that has value beyond the Ark question. The expeditions have also served as training grounds for extreme altitude archaeology techniques that have applications elsewhere. Methods developed for searching Ararat's ice fields have been used to investigate other frozen archaeological sites in the Andes, the Himalayas, and the Alps. But more fundamentally, the searches have revealed something about the nature of evidence itself, about what it takes to prove something extraordinary, about the gap between suggestive and conclusive. In an age when we're used to questions being answerable through sufficient investigation, the Ark remains stubbornly unresolved. The mountain has been searched more thoroughly than most archaeological sites, yet the question remains open. This should tell us something about the limits of what investigation can achieve, about how much ambiguity persists even after extensive effort to eliminate it. As you review these expedition reports, these permit applications, these catalogs of findings and non-findings, you might feel the same frustration that Ark searchers must feel so much effort for such ambiguous results. But there's also something admirably persistent about it. Generation after generation, knowing the odds of definitive discovery are slim, people still organize expeditions, still haul equipment up the mountain, still spend weeks investigating locations that will likely yield nothing conclusive. The searching continues not because the evidence has gotten dramatically better, but because the question itself remains compelling, and because human nature resists leaving questions perpetually unanswered. Even when answers seem to recede further, the more intently we pursue them. By the time you reach the 2010 seconds, the nature of Ark searching has evolved in ways that reflect broader changes in how investigation happens. Social media, crowdfunding, and readily available satellite imagery have democratized the search, allowing smaller groups and even individuals to organize expeditions without major institutional backing. This has both advantages and problems. The advantages are obvious. More people searching means more areas investigated, more perspectives applied to interpreting findings, more technological approaches tried. A computer scientist interested in image analysis might notice patterns in satellite data that a traditional archaeologist would miss. A materials engineer might have insights about wood preservation that humanities-trained researchers lack. The diversity of backgrounds among modern Ark searchers brings fresh thinking to old questions. The problems are equally clear. Without institutional oversight, quality control becomes inconsistent. Expeditions are mounted by people with enthusiasm, but sometimes insufficient expertise in archaeology, mountaineering, or scientific methodology. Findings get announced on social media before being properly verified. Sensational claims spread faster than careful corrections. The line between genuine investigation and publicity seeking becomes blurred. Take the 2010 announcement by a Chinese-Turkish evangelical exploration team called NAMI Noah's Ark, Ministries International. The group held a press conference in Hong Kong where they claimed to have found wooden compartments inside a cave structure on Mount Ararat that they were 99.9% certain was Noah's Ark. They showed photographs and video of what appeared to be wooden walls and partitions inside an ice cave, along with samples they said had been carbon dated to around 4,800 years ago. The announcement made international news. Major outlets covered it, often uncritically repeating the team's claims. But within days, problems with the announcement emerged. First, the team wouldn't reveal the exact location of their discovery, claiming they needed to protect the site from looters and vandals. This made independent verification impossible. Second, several archaeologists and geologists who examined the photographs pointed out that the wooden structures looked remarkably well preserved for something supposedly thousands of years old exposed to the mountain's harsh conditions. The wood appeared almost new, without the degradation you'd expect from millennia of freeze-thaw cycles. Then things got stranger. Randall Price, an archaeologist who had been involved with the team's earlier expeditions, published an open letter claiming that the site had been fabricated. According to Price, Kurdish workers had been paid to haul wood up the mountain and construct a fake site inside an ice cave, which was then discovered by the team. Price provided detailed allegations about who had been involved in the fabrication and why they had done it. NAMI vehemently denied these accusations and threatened legal action. They insisted their find was genuine and provided additional documentation, including affidavits from team members and laboratory reports for the carbon dating. But the damage to credibility was done. The scientific community, already skeptical of ARC claims, dismissed the find as either deliberate fraud or credulous misinterpretation. Major media outlets that had covered the original announcement either ran corrections or simply stopped following the story. What actually happened? Even now, over a decade later, it's hard to say definitively. The site hasn't been independently investigated because NAMI continues to refuse to reveal its exact location. The photographs could show a genuine ancient structure, or a fabrication, or something in between, perhaps old timber that had been rearranged or enhanced to look more Ark-like. Without access to the site and without independent verification of the samples and dating, the find remains in limbo, claimed by the discoverers to be hugely significant, dismissed by critics as fraudulent or misinterpreted, and unavailable for the kind of scrutiny that would resolve the dispute. The NAMI controversy exemplifies a larger problem in archaeology: the lack of robust peer review and verification processes. In mainstream archaeology, significant finds go through multiple levels of scrutiny before being accepted. The site gets excavated according to established protocols, with every layer carefully documented. Multiple experts examine the findings. Materials get tested by independent laboratories. Results get published in peer-reviewed journals where other qualified researchers can critique the methodology and conclusions. Only after surviving this gauntlet does a discovery become accepted as genuine. ARC discoveries rarely go through this process. The sites are often remote and politically sensitive, making independent access difficult. The teams making the discoveries are frequently not professional archaeologists and don't follow standard excavation protocols. Dating gets done by a single laboratory, often one with connections to the expedition team. Results get announced at press conferences or on websites rather than in scientific journals. When criticism emerges, it often comes from blog posts or media reports rather than formal academic publications. This creates a situation where claims and counterclaims proliferate without resolution. NAMI insists they found the Ark. Critics insist it's fraud. But without independent investigation, both positions remain essentially articles of faith rather than conclusions based on verified evidence. The same pattern repeats across numerous Ark discoveries. Enough evidence to claim something significant, not enough transparency for independent verification, resulting in permanent controversy. The question of fraud deserves careful consideration because it affects how we evaluate all Ark claims. How often are findings fabricated? The honest answer is, we don't really know. Outright fabrication is probably rare. It requires considerable effort, money, and coordination to stage a fake discovery, especially on a mountain as remote and dangerous as Ararat. It's much easier to simply misinterpret natural features or overstate the significance of ambiguous findings. But misinterpretation shades into fraud in subtle ways. If you find wood on the mountain, you know that donors and believers want to hear that it's from the Ark. The temptation to emphasize the evidence that supports that conclusion while downplaying alternative explanations is powerful. You might convince yourself that you're not lying, just being appropriately confident about findings that skeptics unfairly dismiss. From your perspective, you're defending truth against biased criticism. From a skeptic's perspective, you're distorting evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. This psychological dynamic affects even well-intentioned researchers. Once you've invested years of your life and substantial resources into searching for the Ark, once you've built an identity around being an Ark researcher, Once you're embedded in a community that shares your beliefs about the Ark's existence, it becomes extremely difficult to objectively evaluate evidence that might undermine those beliefs. You're not necessarily lying, but you're probably not seeing clearly either. The history of archaeology is full of examples where enthusiastic researchers convinced themselves they'd found something momentous, only to have later, more skeptical analysis reveal they'd misinterpreted their data. This happens even in mainstream archaeology with established peer review processes. In archaeology, where such safeguards are weaker, the risk of sincere but mistaken claims is even higher. Yet, absolute skepticism has its own problems. If you approach every Ark claim assuming it's either fraud or misinterpretation, you might miss genuine finds. If the Ark really does exist on Ararat in some form, it will probably be found by Ark researchers, not mainstream archaeologists who consider the search quixotic. So, dismissing all their claims out of hand could mean missing actual evidence. This creates an epistemological bind. The people most motivated to search are also most likely to overinterpret what they find, while the people with the training to properly evaluate findings are least motivated to search. The result is a field where evidence accumulates but understanding doesn't necessarily progress. Each new expedition adds to the pile of tantalizing but inconclusive findings without moving closer to resolution. Consider what we actually know after all these decades of searching. We know that work timber exists at very high elevations on Ararat, with some samples dating to the early Bronze Age. We know that satellite imagery shows several anomalies on the mountain that could potentially be artificial structures, though they could also be natural features. We know that ground-penetrating radar has detected what appear to be cavities or dense objects beneath ice in multiple locations. We know that numerous credible witnesses, pilots, mountaineers, researchers have reported seeing unusual wooden structures or formation on the mountain, with reports showing surprising consistency in describing similar features in similar locations. But we also know wood can reach high elevations through human activity unrelated to the Ark pilgrimages, construction of religious sites, camps, accidental or deliberate transport. Satellite anomalies are common in glaciated mountain terrain and usually turn out to be geological. Ground-penetrating radar produces ambiguous results that require interpretation, especially in complex ice formations. Eyewitness reports of ambiguous features seen from a distance or under difficult conditions are notoriously unreliable, even when witnesses are sincere. The evidence doesn't clearly point in either direction. It's consistent with the Ark's existence, but also consistent with its absence. This is frustrating if you want a definitive answer, but it's actually a meaningful finding in itself. After this much investigation, if the Ark were clearly present, we'd have found it. If it were clearly absent, we'd have conclusively ruled out all the promising locations. The persistence of ambiguity suggests that if the Ark is there, it's fragmented, buried, and preserved in such minimal form that detection requires extraordinary luck or technology we don't yet have, or it's not there at all. And what searchers keep finding are the traces of other human activities that happen to occur in the same general area and time period. Either conclusion is scientifically defensible given the current evidence, which is perhaps the most significant finding from the catalog of disappointments. Even intensive investigation doesn't always resolve questions. Sometimes the answer really is, we don't know, and no amount of additional searching will change that unless something dramatically new emerges, either a far more complete structure than any yet found, or definitive proof that all previous findings have prosaic explanations. This leaves archaeology in an unusual position as the 2020 seconds arrive. The search continues, but with an increasing awareness that definitive proof may be impossible to achieve. Expeditions still go out, findings still get announced, but there's a weariness in the discourse, a sense that the same debates are being rehearsed with different evidence, but similar underlying uncertainty. The mountain has been searched thoroughly enough that any Ark-like structure easily accessible from the surface would likely have been found. What remains are the difficult locations, the deep ice, the avalanche zones, areas that might conceal something, but that resist investigation so strongly that even determining what's there would require industrial-scale excavation that no one has the resources or permits to attempt. And so the catalog of disappointments grows longer each decade, each generation of searchers adding their ambiguous findings to the pile, the question no closer to resolution than when people first started systematically searching over a century ago. You might think this would discourage new searchers, but it doesn't. If anything, the accumulation of near misses and promising hints convinces each new generation that discovery is just barely out of reach, requiring only one more expedition, one more technological advance, one more stroke of luck. The searching continues not because the evidence points clearly toward success, but because the question remains open, and for some people, an open question is an invitation that can't be declined, no matter how many previous attempts have come up short.